welcome back to my channel, and welcome to my very first video of 2022. And I thought it was a good idea to start out the new year by talking about my favorite books from last year. So today I'm going to go through my top 10 favorite books of 2021. So last year I kind of cheated a little bit because instead of picking a favorites list of book for the year for 2020, I basically just picked out my favorite books from each genre. So I had a bunch of favorite books that I talked about at the end of the year. And this year I really just wanted to challenge myself to actually pick out my 10 favorite books. So I did just that, and I didn't actually have any problems picking out my 10 books because it became pretty clear to me which 10 books belonged on the list. But then I also attempted to rank them, and that was very difficult. The books on the list are just so different, and it's really hard to compare them to each other. And also, obviously some of the books I read at the very beginning of the year, so it's been almost a year since I read them. And then other books I read at the end of the year, and it's just been so much time between them that it's just very difficult to compare them to each other. But I've done my best. I have made a top 10 list. Honestly, if I were to reread these books now, the ranking would probably be completely different because I really just had to go off on, how I'm feeling now about these books, even though it's been a long time since I read some of them, but I did my best, and I've settled on a list, and I think I'm pretty happy with it. So before I start going through this list, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. For one, I did not include rereads on this list, so any rereads that I read throughout 2021 that I would have liked to include it on this list, I just didn't. So these are all books that I read for the first time in 2021. And another thing I wanted to mention is that if I had more books in the same series that I wanted to include, I only picked one from each series because I didn't want to have this entire list potentially being occupied by, several books in a series. So I've kind of picked one book from each series to kind of represent that series if I wanted to include several books, if that makes sense. So I guess let's just start going through these books. Like I said, I attempted to rank them. I'm not at all confident in this ranking, but I feel pretty good about it, so I think it's somewhat correct. So in the 10th place, I have Galaxies and Oceans by N.R. Walker. This is actually the only book on this list that I didn't give 5 stars to. At the time that I read this, I gave it 4.5 stars. But the more time that is passed, the more I kind of think about this book. For some reason, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. And in my mind, it kind of feels more like a 5-star rating than a 4.5, which is what I gave it at the time. The thing is that I read this book in the same month that I read the 2 books that are on my top 2 places on this list. So compared to those 2 books, it wasn't quite up there. But I think if I would have read it at any other point of the year, basically, it probably would have been a 5-star. So I'm kind of thinking on it as a 5-star book, even though I didn't rate it that at the time. So there's nothing really spectacular about this book. It's just such a well-written romance. It basically takes place in a small town on an island in Australia. And it's just so atmospheric. You just have that small town setting that I absolutely loved. And it was just well done. The romance was wonderful. The little town where this story was set was wonderful. All the side characters, like I said, the setting, just everything worked for me with this book. So it's kind of like a slow, quiet book, even though it starts out very dramatically because one of the main characters, he's pretty much faking his own death in order to get away from his violent ex. But he comes to this small town and he meets our other main character, and it's just such a wonderful romance. So this book is in my 10th place. Then at number 9, we have One Man's Trash by Marie Sexton. And this book is one of the very last books that I read in 2021. I think it was the second to last book that I read in the year, so it's very recently that I read this book, but it just kind of blew me away. This is a romance, but it's a romance that is a lot darker and a lot grittier than the romances that I usually read. Both of our two main characters, they have a lot of baggage. They have been through some terrible things in their lives, and they are in a pretty bad place, both of them, when this book starts and when they meet each other. But then, like, somehow, kind of against all odds, they come together and they are able to build a relationship, and I just loved following them through this book. It was not an easy journey. It was pretty bumpy. There is a lot of like tough stuff that they have to deal with, and there were some scenes in this book that were really uncomfortable to read. Actually, I would probably look up trigger warnings for this book if you need those, because this was just a tough book to read. But the end was so rewarding. I just loved following these two characters and see where they ended up, because, you know, where they ended up, it wasn't perfect, but they were both in such good place compared to where they were in the beginning of the book. And I just rooted for these characters so much, and I loved seeing how they ended up. So this book was just, it was really good. It was different, like I said, from the romances that I usually read, but I loved it. And like, if this is any indication of what I can expect from Marie Sexton's other books, then, you know, I can't wait. I will have a lot of great reading ahead of me, so I can't wait to check out more of her books. Then in the 8th place we have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Clune. This book, I don't feel like I really need to say a lot about it. It's a very popular book on BookTube, so, you know, a lot of people have read it and a lot of people love it. This one was just such a great read for me. It has just a lot of things that I love in books, like found families. It had a great romance, even though the romance, I wouldn't say it's not the main story in this one. It just has some wonderful, like, magical setting. It has like diverse characters. It was just like really well written, and it's like a pretty fluffy book in many ways, but it has a more serious and darker backdrop, and I just really kind of love that mix. Like, after reading this book, I just want to read more books from T.J. Clune. I have one book by this author that I've had on my Kindle pretty much since the day that I got it. I bought it like at the very start, and that I own my Kindle, and I still haven't read that one. And there are like tons of other books by T.J. Clune that I'm excited to read, so hopefully in 2021 I can check out some more. But yeah, this one definitely belongs on this list, so I put it in the 8th place. Then at place number 7 we have another one that is maybe a little bit darker than the romances that I usually read, and that is Special Delivery by Heidi Cullinan. This one, it's kind of difficult to explain, because I said it's a little bit dark, but also not really. It's not like dark. I guess it's just that the characters are a little bit different than the characters that I feel like you often meet in romances. They're not like instantly likable. I mean, one of the characters I kind of liked from the start. The other one, I had to take some time with him, because he grew on me, but I wasn't sure how I felt about him in the beginning. And also there is a third character in here that is very important to the story that I didn't really like at all. So like, this book, it felt a little bit different to me than the other ones, but, you know, I still absolutely love this one. I already knew that Heidi Cullinan was a great writer, because I have read another book by her several years ago now that I absolutely loved as well. And I haven't quite been able to stop thinking about that book, so I was excited to pick up more books from her, and her writing style, I think, is just wonderful. I think that was one of my favorite things about this book, and one of the reasons I'm just excited to pick up more books by her. But this book, like I said, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's basically like a road trip book. One of our main characters, he doesn't have like a good home life. He lives with his aunt and uncle, and they don't really get along. So when this other main character, he drives a truck, and he happens to deliver some things to the pharmacy where our other main character works. So they meet each other, and there's this like instant connection, and there's some circumstances there, but they end up going on a road trip together basically. And their relationship develop, and things happen, and it was just a great book. I wasn't sure what to expect from it going in. Like I said, I had read from the author before and I knew that I loved her writing, but I wasn't sure what I was going to feel about this one. I had had it on my Kindle for years, and I guess there's a reason why I hadn't picked it up earlier, just because I wasn't sure, but I ended up loving this one, and I can't wait to pick up more books by Heidi Cullinan, and there's more books in the series as well that I want to pick up really soon, so hopefully I can do that. Then we are at place number 6, and I decided to put Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb on this place. I read this entire trilogy in 2021. The first book was a reread, and then the second and third book I read for the first time, and I just loved the entire series. And this one is the second book, and it was my favorite, which is why I decided to put this on my list. The third book I don't think talked about on this channel, because I think I finished it in November and I never got around to do a wrap-up in November, so I never talked about my feelings about that book. I just wanted to mention that, you know, I really enjoyed the third book as well, but something about the pacing in that one felt a little bit off to me, because these books, they are kind of like slow, they aren't very rushed, and there aren't a lot of action, which is part of the reason why I love them, because I'm figuring out that I'm kind of preferring it that way when it comes to fantasy. But there was something about the final book that was kind of like, you know, the story was going along, and then in the, I want to say like 50 to 100 final pages of that book, just everything happened at once. It was like the story exploded and so much was happening, and then everything wrapped up, and it just felt very rushed compared to the rest of the book and the rest of the series. So that is why the third book wasn't quite up there for me. I still gave it a 4.5 stars, so I still loved it, but I just found the second book in the series to be better. So that's why I included this one on the list. I just love this fantasy series. I think it's so well done. I love Robin Hobb's writing. And like, you know, this is just the first trilogy of several books that are set in the same universe. So I will eventually pick up more books, but you know, this is kind of a big fantasy series, like the books are very chunky, so I decided I needed a little bit of a break from it after reading the first trilogy, but you know, absolutely loved it. One of my favorite fantasy series for sure, so this one definitely deserves a spot in my list. Then we come to the 5th place on my list, and there we have Grumpy Bear by Slade James. And this was actually the very first book that I gave 5 stars to in 2021. So obviously, you know, it's been a while since I read it. I think I probably read it in February, so it's been almost a year. And for that reason, it was difficult to figure out where I should put it on the list, because it's kind of difficult to figure out, you know, how I felt about it compared to the other books that are more recent reads. But I decided, you know, sort of in the middle of the list seemed like a good place to put it, because at the time that I read it, I absolutely loved this book. This is a romance, and it's kind of like a opposites attract, kind of grumpy sunshine type of romance. It's basically a romance between the owner of like a campground and this young man who comes to this campground to, just because he doesn't really have anywhere else to go. He's a musician, but it's not really working out for him, and he just needs money and he needs a job for the summer, so he ends up going with a friend to this campground to see if he can find some work there. And you know, the two of them meet, things happen, and it's just a really fun romance. Slade James's writing is absolutely wonderful. There are a couple of like shorter stories, novellas, also set in the same universe that I also read in 2021, and they were also great. But this book was just wonderful, you know, well written, great setting, great characters, great romance, just everything I loved about this book, so definitely deserves a place in my list. Then we come to number 4 in my list, and there I have Better Than People by Roan Parish. And this is the first book in her Garnet Run series, and I actually read the entire series in 2021, or you know, the books that are out so far. And I also want to mention the third book, which is The Lights on Knockbridge Lane. That one is a Christmas story, so I read that one in December, and I absolutely love that one as well. That one is another 5-star book for me, and it probably would have been on this list as well, which is why I wanted to mention it. But I think I loved Better Than People just a little bit more, which is why I've decided to use that one to represent this series. But you know, the entire series is just wonderful. So I think one of the main reasons I loved Better Than People so much is because of one of our main characters, Simon, who is suffering from pretty severe anxiety. And I guess I just, you know, it was just kind of relatable to me, I guess, even though, you know, I've never been in the same place as Simon is. You know, his anxiety is just at a whole different level than anything I've ever experienced, but still, there was just so many things that felt relatable to me. He doesn't really interact with other people, he works from home, you know, he doesn't really talk to people. And then he meets our other main character, Jack, through an app, basically, because Jack, he has several dogs. And then, you know, one day he is out with his dogs and he breaks his leg. So, you know, for that reason, he can't take properly care of his animals, so he just asks for help on this app. And then Simon responds, you know, he really loves dogs, but, you know, he can't have a dog of his own because he lives with his grandmother, I think it was, and his grandmother is allergic, so he can't have any animals at home. But when he sees this request from Jack, he decides to offer his help, and that's basically how the two of them meet, and it's just such a wonderful, wonderful romance. Roan Parish's writing style is great. I've really, you know, this one was the first book that I read from Roan Parish, and I was just blown away by it. And I ended up reading, I think, 4 of her books this year, or in 2021, so she has definitely become one of my favorite romance writers, and I can't wait to read, you know, her other books as well. But yeah, Better Than People, definitely one of my favorite books of the year. Then we come into my top 3. And in the 3rd place, I have a book that I just really had no idea where I was going to put on this list, because, you know, the way I feel about this book is just so different to how I feel about all the other books that I've read this year and all the other books that are on this list. I mean, it's Heartstopper Volume 4 by Alice Osman. And like I said, I just feel so differently about this series, because this series is just like pure comfort to me. I read this entire series this year. The first 3 books were rereads, which is why I'm not talking about them here. But this is the 4th book, and this year I read this one for the first time. You guys already know how much I love this series. It's definitely one of my favorite series. It's my favorite graphic novel series for sure. And it's just such a wonderful, comforting, heartwarming story. Like I said, this series is just pure comfort to me, and I think I probably have a smile on my face the entire time that I'm reading these books. This one, I want to say, is just a tiny bit darker than the other books in the series, because we really start to see and learn more about the things that Charlie, one of the main characters, is struggling with. But just there's also just like a ton of love, and it's just overall, this book just gives me such a heartwarming, like, positive feeling. I think, you know, even the more difficult topics in here is just handled really well. So yeah, I mean, this one, you know, it's no surprise, it's definitely in my favorites list. I knew it had to be towards the top, because, you know, no other books makes me feel quite like this book does. But yeah, I put it in the 3rd place, and I feel pretty happy with that. But yeah, you know, you guys already knew I love this book. Then at the 2nd place on my favorites list, we have The Mysterious and Amazing Blue Billings by Lily Morton. This is the kind of book that has just grown on me throughout this year. I remember at the time that I read this book, and that was actually around the time of my birthday. I think I read this book on my actual birthday. And I remember when I finished this book, I wasn't entirely sure that I was going to give it 5 stars. It felt like it could be more of a 4.5 stars. Like, I loved it, but I wasn't sure it was quite up there. In the end, I decided to give it 5 stars, and, you know, throughout the year, I just haven't been able to stop thinking about this book. And I think the main reason why I love this book so much is the romance and the couple that we're following in this book, because I think they're probably my favorite couple of the year. So this book is primarily a romance, but it's also like a paranormal ghost story. One of the main characters, Levi, he comes to, I think it was York, in England because he has inherited a house. So he comes to York and he moves into this house, and it turns out that the house is haunted. And then, our other main character, Blue, he is a psychic. And the two of them meet, and Blue kind of agrees to help out in the house, trying to figure out what's going on in Levy's house and, trying to do something about the ghosts that are there. And it's just such a good book. Like I said, I absolutely love this romance. This pairing is just thinking about them makes me smile, basically. But like the story itself, the whole ghost story, the paranormal elements, they are also great. I already knew that Lily Morton was one of my favorite romance writers, even though I'd only read one of her books before this one, but that one was just so good. And I love her writing style, and this book kind of just cemented her place at the very top for me when it comes to romance authors, because this book was so good. And I also read the second book in the series, which is called The Quiet House, this year. I didn't love that one quite as much as this one, but it was still great. And I just can't wait to read more by Lily Morton because, absolutely love her books. And then we come to the first place on my list. And I think if you've been following me for this year, you might be able to tell which book I'm going to mention next, because I think I've mentioned a few times this year that this book, I have considered this book my favorite of the year at the time that I mentioned it. And at the end of the year, I still consider it my favorite book of the year. I couldn't really think of any other book that would quite be able to top this one for me. Even though, some of the books that I've mentioned on this list, it's very close, I've loved all of the books on this list, but this one, maybe just a tiny bit more. So the book that I decided to put on first place for the year is The Gentle Art of Fortune Hunting by K.J. Charles. This is a historical romance, and I definitely have a soft spot for historical romance when it's done well. And this one is just done incredibly well, in my opinion. So in this book, we meet our two main characters, Robin and Hart. And Robin, he is essentially a fortune hunter. So his goal is basically to marry rich. And so he kind of sets his eyes on Hart's niece. And he, pays her attention, and Hart, he just gets a little suspicious because he is very protective of his niece, and he's like, who is this guy, and what are his intentions? And so he kind of starts to look into who Robin is, and, things develop, and they develop in a kind of a different way that I haven't seen in a lot of other romances, but, the way K.J. Charles does it in this book is just, perfect, in my opinion. I absolutely loved this romance. I loved this couple. I loved, how things developed between them. I loved the story, the side characters, just everything about this book was so good. And I already knew that K.J. Charles was a great writer, but I actually only read one of her books prior to this one, and that was a while back, so I wasn't surprised that I loved this so much, but I guess maybe I was a little surprised because I think the first book that I read by K.J. Charles was more like a 4-star to me. But then I just ended up absolutely loving this one, and now I can't wait to read her other books because I already have several of them on my TBR, so I had intended to read more by her in 2021, but I never got around to it, so fingers crossed for 2022. I definitely hope to read more of her books then. And this book definitely deserves its place on the very top of my list. It was really good, and I think if you're someone who wants to try some historical romance but doesn't really know where to start, then maybe K.J. Charles would be a good place to start. I know her books are generally pretty well loved, and definitely gets the highest recommendations from me, at least this book. So yeah, would definitely recommend. So that was my favorite books of 2021. I'm so happy with this list in the sense that, when I think back on all these books, I just remember how much I enjoyed reading them, and I can't wait to discover more favorite books in 2022. But I think that's going to be it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, you can always hit like down below, or you can subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos from me. But that's going to be it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!